Atlanta, late 1990s. A small comedy club, half empty on a Tuesday night. The kind of room where the air conditioning rattled louder than some of the laughs. Katt Williams was 3 minutes into his set when the back door opened, and a man slipped inside without anyone announcing him. He took a seat near the wall, ordered nothing, and said nothing. Most of the room didn't notice. Katt Williams did. The man was Dave Chappelle. Not yet the Dave Chappelle of network deals and sketch comedy that would later become part of television history. At that point, Chappelle was already known among comics, respected, sharp, a name that other performers spoke about with a kind of careful admiration. He wasn't famous to the audience in that club. Most of the people sitting at those small round tables, nursing drinks they'd nursed for an hour, wouldn't have recognized him if he'd walked past their table. But to the people on stage, and to the people working the room, his presence meant something. It meant someone who understood the craft was sitting in the dark, watching. Atlanta's comedy scene in the late 1990s wasn't what it would become. There was no large infrastructure of major clubs and televised showcases the way there would be a decade later. What existed was a patchwork of smaller rooms, bars with a stage in the corner, restaurants that cleared out a section on certain nights, clubs that ran on word of mouth and the willingness of comedians to show up for almost nothing. The crowds were unpredictable. Some nights a room would be packed with people who came specifically to laugh. Other nights, like this one, the room held just enough people to make it worth turning the lights down. For comedians coming up in that scene, the work was constant and largely invisible. There were no cameras, no clips that would circulate later, no way to know which night might matter more than another. You showed up, you got your slot, often late, often short, and you tried to make something work in front of whoever happened to be there. Sometimes that meant testing a joke for the first time and watching it die in real time. Sometimes it meant finding, almost by accident, a rhythm that would stay in the act for years. For Katt Williams, that night was not supposed to be anything special. It was one more set, one more room, one more chance to sharpen material that wasn't fully formed yet. He had been working Atlanta's club circuit for a while by then. Small stages, late slots, rooms that sometimes had more chairs than people in them. The hustle wasn't glamorous. It meant driving between venues on the same night, sometimes performing twice in different rooms for small amounts of money, sometimes for none at all. It meant being patient with material that wasn't ready, and patient with audiences that weren't always paying attention. But it also meant something else. It meant freedom. In those rooms, with no cameras and no expectations beyond the next 10 minutes, a young comedian could take risks that wouldn't be possible on a bigger stage. He could try a bit 3 different ways in 3 different sets and see which version actually worked. He could fail in front of 12 people instead of 1,200. That freedom is part of how a comedic voice gets built, not in the big moments, but in the quiet, repetitive ones that nobody remembers except the person living through them. By then, Katt Williams had a rhythm developing, quick, observational, a little unpredictable. He liked to take something ordinary, something everyone in the room had seen 100 times, and turn it sideways until the audience saw it differently. Some nights that rhythm clicked instantly. Other nights it took the room a minute to catch up. That particular Tuesday, the room was a few seconds slow, but it was catching up. And now there was someone in the back who didn't need a few seconds. Chappelle's reputation, even then, carried weight. Comics talked about him the way musicians talk about another musician who has something they can't quite name. Timing, instinct, an ability to read a room before the room knew it was being read. He had already built a name for himself in New York and on the road, doing the kind of work that other comedians studied. When someone like that walked into a small room unannounced, word moved fast, even if the audience never knew. By the time most people in the crowd had ordered their second drink, 2 or 3 comics near the bar already knew exactly who had just walked in, and exactly what that meant for whoever was on stage. By the time Katt Williams reached the middle of his set, he knew too. He didn't turn to look, not directly. But comedians develop a sense for where attention is sitting in a room, the same way a musician can feel where the silence is heaviest. He felt it near the back wall. He kept going. The material he was working that night wasn't his strongest yet. Some of it was still being shaped, tested, thrown at the wall to see what stuck. There's a particular kind of vulnerability in that. An audience watching a comedian work out new material is watching someone build something in real time, mistakes included. And now, somewhere in that audience, was a comic whose opinion could matter more than anyone else's in the room. He didn't change his set. That decision, whether conscious or not, said something about him even then. He didn't reach for his safest jokes. He didn't try to perform for the one person whose presence he'd noticed. He kept working the way he had been working, testing the same lines, taking the same risks. If anything, the energy sharpened. Not louder, sharper. The set moved through its highs and lows, the way sets do. A bit about something mundane that turned into something the room didn't expect. A pause that landed exactly where it needed to. A line that almost didn't get there in time, but did. The kind of set that, on a different night, with a different audience in the back row, might have just been another Tuesday. But it wasn't just another Tuesday. Not for Katt Williams, even if he didn't fully know it yet. When his time was up, he closed the way he usually did. Clean. No over-explaining. No extra few seconds trying to squeeze out one more laugh. He walked off into the side area near the bar, where most comics gathered between sets to talk, to vent, to ask each other how the room felt from where they were standing. The lights near the bar were dimmer than the stage lights, just bright enough to see faces, and the air carried that mix of stale smoke and cheap drinks that every club from that era seemed to share. And there, near the wall, was Chappelle. He hadn't moved. He hadn't laughed loudly during the set, at least not in any way that stood out from across the room. He hadn't talked to anyone near him. He had simply watched, the way someone watches when they're not there to be entertained, but to see. His arms were loosely crossed, his expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that, in a room full of restless people waiting for the next act, stood out precisely because it didn't try to. This was the moment. Not a dramatic one, not one with raised voices or big gestures. Just 2 comedians standing near each other in a half-empty club, one of them young and still finding his footing, the other already carrying a reputation that meant something in rooms like this one. Katt Williams had a choice in that moment, the kind of choice comedians make constantly, usually without thinking about it afterward. He could walk past, give a nod, keep it light, the way performers often do when they don't want to seem like they're chasing approval, or he could acknowledge what had just happened, that someone whose opinion mattered had just watched him work through unfinished material in a room that wasn't full, on a night that wasn't special. He chose to walk toward him. What happened next has been described by people who were in that club in different ways over the years. Some remember exact words, others remember none at all. But the detail that has stayed consistent, the detail that comedians who were there still bring up, is this. Chappelle didn't say much. didn't offer a list of notes. He didn't critique the set joke by joke. He didn't say anything that sounded like a prediction about the future. According to those who were there, he looked at Katt Williams for a moment, long enough to register, not long enough to feel like a performance of its own, gave a small nod, the kind that doesn't need explanation if you've spent enough time around people who take the work seriously, and said something short, brief, almost nothing on the surface. And then he left. For someone outside the world of stand-up, that might sound like indifference, a missed opportunity, a legend walking in, watching, and walking out without much to show for it. But for the people in that room, for Katt Williams especially, it didn't read that way at all. In comedy, silence after a set can mean a lot of things. It can mean a joke didn't land. It can mean the room is still processing. But silence from another comedian, a comedian who has seen thousands of sets, who knows exactly what effort looks like, what risk looks like, what it means to try something untested in front of strangers. Silence from someone like that can be its own kind of statement. Chappelle hadn't laughed the loudest. He hadn't stayed to chat. He hadn't offered advice. What he had done was simpler than all of that. He had stayed. He had watched the whole thing start to finish without checking the time or glancing toward the door. And in a room full of people who were there for an hour of distraction, he was there for something else, to see what someone was building. That night didn't change Katt Williams's career overnight. There was no contract signed, no late-night call from a manager, no headline. The next night he was probably in another small room working through more unfinished material in front of another audience that didn't know who was watching. That's how the climb worked back then. One room at a time, one set at a time, with almost no guarantee that anyone who mattered was paying attention. But something about that night stayed with him. Not because of what was said, by most accounts almost nothing was, but because of what wasn't said. The absence of critique, the absence of advice, the simple fact that someone whose instincts he respected had watched him take risks with material that wasn't ready yet, and hadn't walked away unimpressed enough to leave early. In the years that followed, both men's careers moved in directions that, looking back, seem almost inevitable, though at the time, nothing about it felt inevitable at all. Chappelle's name would eventually become known far beyond comedy clubs, his work becoming part of how an entire generation talked about television and comedy. Katt Williams would spend years building his own voice, his own rhythm, his own way of turning the ordinary into something the audience didn't see coming. The same instinct that was already visible, even in its early form, on that Tuesday night in Atlanta. Neither man could have known, standing near that wall, how far either of their paths would go. All that existed in that moment was the work and the recognition of it. What that night revealed about Katt Williams wasn't about talent alone. Plenty of people in those clubs had talent. What it revealed was a willingness to keep working, even with the wrong person, or the right person, sitting in the back row. He didn't perform differently because Chappelle was there. He performed the way he always did, take it or leave it, and let the work speak. That kind of consistency, the refusal to perform for an audience of one, is something that doesn't show up in highlight reels, but it's often the thing that separates comedians who last from comedians who don't. What it revealed about Chappelle was something quieter, a kind of respect that didn't need to be announced. The instinct to recognize something real, even in its unfinished form,
and to acknowledge it without making a show of the acknowledgement itself.
In an industry built on loud reactions, laughter, applause, reviews, his silence was its own kind of compliment, the kind that only meant something because of who it came from. It would have been easy for him to say nothing at all, to leave without a word, and no one would have thought twice. The fact that he stopped, even briefly, even wordlessly, said more than a review ever could. Looking back at that night now, what stands out isn't the joke that worked best, or the one that almost didn't land. It's the image of two people standing near a wall in a half-empty club, one of them carrying a name that meant something, the other carrying a name that hadn't meant anything yet. And the quiet space between them, filled with everything that didn't need to be said. Years later, when people would ask Katt Williams about his early days in Atlanta, that night would come up, not as a turning point with fireworks, but as a memory that simply stained. A small room, a back door opening, a man who said almost nothing and somehow said everything that mattered. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not the big stages, not the specials, not the moments that ended up on camera, but a Tuesday night, a half-empty room, and a silence that turned out to be one of the loudest things either man ever experienced.